We're delighted to welcome the author of Furniture in Architecture, Aiden Walker, in conversation with renowned furniture designer Luke Hughes. This conversation follows the highly successful talk that Luke gave to the Friends in the spring of last year on the topic of the arts and crafts in the digital age. Today, I hope we'll gain an insight into how at least one of the iconic Gordon Russell designs is still relevant 40 years after Sir Gordon's death, as they discuss the breadth of Luke's work. Gentlemen.
Christopher, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. My name is Aiden Walker. It is a genuine delight to be doing this, even though we're all spread all over the four corners of the earth, or at least of the kingdom of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. I just wanted to say a little bit about myself, partly because, you know, once you get Luke talking, he basically doesn't stop. So there's just wanted to say just a couple of things about kind of why I'm here, if you like. One of them is that I grew up in Worcester, and I have a very fond memory of the Lig and Arms in Broadway, where I went to my first League of Pity dance at the age of a very hot-handed age of 15. I can't remember whether any romantic involvements ensued, but that was certainly my intention when I went. So Broadway means a great deal to me through my childhood and youth, and it's a real delight to re-enter, if you like, that kind of relationship, and particularly through the medium of furniture. Luke and I share quite a number of different, I suppose you could say, backgrounds. We're both middle-class furniture makers. He is one very, very much more successful than I ever was. So I ended up basically writing about it. I can say this was a labor of love, this book, not least because I'm very fond of Luke as a great personal friend. We've known each other many more years than we care to admit, or than I care to admit anyway. And indeed, I first met him when I was not actually editor, but deputy editor of Woodworker magazine, which you see on the right. Luke, again, typically has chosen that particular cover because his name appears writ large. But I was editing it until 1988. This is an issue from 1989. But one of the things that I most enjoyed about meeting him all those years ago, this was, as I say, late 80s, was somebody who knew craftsmanship, who had what we might say craftsmanship coming out of his fingers, but who was almost as good a writer as I am. And indeed, he's a much better craftsman than I am. So I think that that kind of gives us a good balance. I didn't make it in craftsmanship. I was a cabinet maker for 10 years without a formal training, just like you, Luke. But what I didn't have was Luke's business acumen, and I think that's one of the things that has kept him doing what he was doing. We'll hear a good deal more from him about how he came to be where he is. One of the things that we wanted to do when we first started work on the book, it was a great moment for me. I met him at a exhibition to do with hotel and leisure furniture, and he waved a finger at me and said, "I want you to write my book," which was great. I said, "Well, I want to too then." And several years later, it happened. It took us quite a while to persuade, for instance, the Yale University Press, who very typically in the book publishing industry took 6 months to say no. But then we took the rewritten proposal to Thames Hudson, who you may or may not know are probably the premier design publisher, both in this country and in the United States. And the editorial director phoned me back that same afternoon. So there you have the differences, if you like, in responses to the book. The Encyclopedia of Wood was one of the first on your screens. I'm looking at it on my left. I know that sometimes these things swap round. That was one of the first collaborations we did. Luke, I was editing the book, and Luke wrote a great many of the stories. One of the sort of sections of the book is things like taking, I don't know, the history of cork, for instance, and Luke was most instrumental in making that happen. But that was again late 80s, early 90s, and here we are again with a book about what he's been doing for the last 35 years and not about what I've been doing. So now, Luke, you can start talking and I can stop.
We design and make furniture for sensitive architectural settings. We don't do residential furniture or domestic, largely because you never quite get the quantities that are desirable. We tend to design for 30 to 50 year life expectancy, sometimes for Oxford and Cambridge colleges or the big museums, 100 years or more. If it lasts 100 years, it'll probably last a lot longer than that, but that's the kind of factor that we build in when we're designing the joints or the gluing or the fixings and so on. The fundamental principle, which I'll come back to later on, is that furniture should embellish the space and not embarrass it. And I'll come back to that a bit later. And another is keeping great buildings relevant in a rapidly changing world is ultimately down to the quality of the furniture. Clients include Harvard, Yale, more than 60 out of the 68 Oxford and Cambridge colleges, 25 private schools, 19 major academic libraries, 24 major cathedrals. I think it's more than 150 parish churches now, 7 national museums, 5 royal palaces, 2 supreme courts, 9 synagogues, and a partridge in the pear tree. Exactly. The principal areas of activity are the major institutions, which tend to be in the academic and public realm. And a lot of that was similar to GR in the 50s and 60s. Worship is amazing how much churches, which have to be reconfigured a lot, increasingly because of the threats to keeping the buildings up to date and warm and relevant to village communities. Corporate meeting and conference rooms we don't do so much of now. It's a bit of a mug's game really, but we do it. But everything tends to get thrown out after 10 years, and that's very depressing. We do a certain amount of luxury hotels. I don't really like it very much, but we do get involved. A certain amount of street furniture and very occasional private commissions. We've done quite a lot for the Prince of Wales down the road at Highgrove and so on. But this is the big theme, the thought for the day, if you like, which is about why furniture articulates and embellishes a space. This is a 13th century barn, very close to where I'm speaking from down in Tisbury at the moment. It was owned by the Abbess of Shaftesbury and was built around 1240. And it's a magnificent space. It's actually where we held the launch of the book in September. And inside, it's structured like a lot of buildings of that kind. There are very much fewer secular buildings than there are religious ones that still survive. But the roof space and the thickness of the walls and the light and the fall is not dissimilar to what you might expect a major church to be. It's a magnificent space, and it's now being turned into an art gallery. By contrast, this is a Cistercian Abbey in France, lots around Europe. That's also a stone barn. It's got higher walls and more windows, and it's got side aisles and so on. But essentially, it's the same. It's a stone barn. And the difference inside is that the roof is stone rather than wood. And there's a very good reason for that. One is that abbeys had a tendency to burn down. And secondly, because they wanted the music to resonate through those spaces. So a lot of ecclesiastical buildings of the Middle Ages had stone vaults because of the resonance of the music. But it is a stone barn until the moment when you put a table at one end. And then it becomes a church. And it's the placing of that single piece of furniture into that space that articulates its use. It clearly is about something, about maybe eating or meeting or breaking bread or anything else. But the difference is huge as soon as you put that single piece of furniture into that wonderful architectural space. And that, I think, is what furniture does for any space. That's why when you see great buildings that are cluttered or got too much furniture in it, it's the clutter that actually diminishes its purpose. It takes the articulation of that space down a peg or three. Now, an altar, which is basically a table, is essentially, at its simplest, a vertical element supporting a horizontal element around which you gather. It could be incredibly simple, like this one in San Giovanni de Venere in the Abruzzo, or a big square box with a saint's relic inside. It could be dressed up with embroidery, as here in Winchester Cathedral. It could be a mixture of stone as a table and a wooden top. It could be a single monolithic block like the Henry Moore in St. Stephen's, Walbrook. It could be hideous, like this was where we started in Ely, with no, it was designed by George Pace in about 1970. And I saw it when I was an undergraduate. And I thought then that it had to, it really ought to go, but it's taken another 30, 40 years to actually happen. But even the platform on which it sits bears no resemblance to the architecture directly underneath the dome. This is actually what we did design to go underneath that fantastic space there. And the furniture was all made actually, well, those choir furniture was all made just up the road by Fine Furniture. But you'll see what we were trying to do is to get something to work with the architecture around it, and indeed the magnificent space. There's a lot of stories because we got eels carved all the way around the edges.
I was going to interrupt you again with that particular point, knowing as we both enjoyably had these conversations about the altar in Ely, that it was that particular piece encapsulates a great number of stories about the town itself, doesn't it? About its history, about the wealth that came from eels.
Well, Ely became very rich after the 7th century because it had the monopoly on eels.
Yeah.
And because if you were in a completely Catholic society as it was then, and you weren't allowed to eat meat on Fridays or on holy days,
yeah,
he who had the monopoly on the fish that you could eat was doing rather well, and Ely got very rich on eels. There was a reason why we carved the eels, or the representation of eels, was we wanted the thing to glitter in a dark, gloomy November evensong late evening environment when you come in from the west door, and it's a hell of a space. I mean, it's about 60, 70 meters, maybe more. And if it doesn't focus the attention onto the space directly underneath that magnificent octagon above, you're missing something of the liturgy, but you're also not bringing the architecture to life in that same way.
Could you just go back a couple of slides just to show us the whole piece?
There we go.
I would just like everybody to recognize what kind of cabinet making challenges there are in making something like this. It's absolutely extraordinary, absolutely amazing piece of craftsmanship, and a really, really very bold piece of design as well. You really have to have confidence in your craftspeople if you've designed something like this, you know, with an outward curve, with this upward. I don't really even have the technical language to describe it, but this is not an easy thing to make, ladies and gentlemen. I assure you.
Well, everybody. What was lovely, actually, one of the love when I'm designing these kinds of things is actually thinking about the collaborations that might happen. You don't always know that they will work, but craftsmen tend to love what they do, especially if they operate in small workshops rather than large factories. And it's amazing what creativity one can set alight, the art of the possible. And I think that's probably one of the most stimulating things of working with such a team, or team all around the country, on such a diverse scope of projects, some of which you'll see. But the carving, the carving was done by another member of the Art Workers Guild, actually, Georgi Makatuchian. He's an Armenian. But he's one of the most fantastic carvers. And Phil Suri, who was a letter cutter, who studied in the Kindersley workshop, but he did the gilding. But there's a hell of a lot of, you're quite right, there's a hell of a lot of work goes in. But the other point about it, the whole thing clears away in, all the furniture can be cleared away in about 12 minutes. So they can turn it around for a concert or Remembrance Day service and so on. But it's quite practical, and it has the design of the chairs for the clergy is loosely based on Charlemagne's throne at Aachen, which is where he was, which I think he nicked from Ravenna in the early 800. In 800. Anyway, it was a lot of fun, but it does seem to work and everybody seems to love it, which is great. Another one which was quite bold, we couldn't think what to do with St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. And St Giles, of course, it's the Church of Scotland, and they have a much more clear focus on the liturgy of the word and less of the liturgy of the sacrament, of breaking bread. There's a lot of Calvinist tradition in that, and one couldn't have any echo of possibility that it could be hollow or a saint's relic could hide inside. And the then minister, Gillespie Macmillan, decided he was happy, and so were the Office of Worship and Doctrine of the Church of Scotland, if we had a single block of marble, weighed 4.9 tons, plonked right the way in the middle of the crossing. But the big challenge was how to get it to focus the mind again when you come in from the west door, and to speak of the purpose that you wanted it to speak of, right in the middle of that slightly gloomy, pinky grey sandstone of St Giles, but to do something which wasn't too mannered. But again, it comes down to the quality of the craftsman you're working with. This is, on the right is Mauro Rovi in Pietrasanta. It actually the marble came out of the same quarry where Michelangelo is supposed to have excavated the David. And they're still digging away there. But Mauro and his family run a stone yard in Pietrasanta. But we had a lot of fun trying to find a block that was going to be big enough. Note Land Cruiser for scale. It gives you an idea of how big these blocks are. But you can imagine also the logistical problems getting 4.5 ton block up the stairs and into the cathedral. But the other problem was, how do you deal with the surface and not make it look just polished like a hospital or hotel foyer? And we thought that actually the only way was to texture it. And that comes down to hands and love. And it took Andrea, who's on the left here, it took him 3 weeks to chisel away at that block of marble to get that effect on the block. But it's where, yes, the machines can extract the block, and yes, they can saw it very precisely within a millimeter of where you want it. But ultimately, the thing that makes it sing is handcraft still, and I will come on to that a bit more later. So that comes on to the thought for the day, I suppose, which is that furniture should embellish and articulate the space and not embarrass it. And if you're up for this, I'll share with you some embarrassments. Is that a good time for that? Well, you tell me, everybody. Vote with your feet. This is in a Renaissance town hall in Perugia. They got airline seats put into this fantastic Renaissance town hall. Can you believe it? This is the Chapel of the Resurrection in Indiana, where they had these vast and hideous pews which they couldn't move. Before and after tells the story best of all. The problem was the benches, apart from that they were ugly, was that they couldn't move them. And it's a Lutheran university, but they were only able really to use the chapel, which seats 1,600 people on the ground floor alone, for services on Sunday. What they wanted to do was to use it for concerts, for graduation services, for chamber concerts, move it around and so on. And that is where we ended up with putting the reworked version of the Coventry Cathedral chair. And there it is, the new production version. But it fits the building absolutely spot on. The color was right, but the massing was right. The rhythm of the legs and the woodwork was right. It completely transformed the space, and we've been able to design a linking mechanism so they can swing it round, and they change it every day. Now they're using it absolutely every day of the week. How
much are you going to tell us about the re-engineering of the chair, Luke? And I wonder whether all the everybody who's with us knows the original story of the Coventry Cathedral chair.
Well, I think
you could tell us a
most
bit more.
people, anything to do with the GR Museum, will know about the Coventry Cathedral chair. The building, this building, is a knockoff of Coventry Cathedral. There's no question about that.
Yeah, I don't think Valparaiso would be quite so pleased to hear you call it that.
Well,
inspired by or an homage, perhaps.
It is incredibly close. If you look at the footprint,
just with a few more windows.
With a few more windows. But what we did have to do was to make the chair quite a lot larger. American Diet has challenged people like Donald Trump to a certain extent. So we did have to make the chair wider and deeper and a little bit higher. When we started changing those little details, it made an enormous difference to the turning moments on the individual pieces of timber in the chair. And we did have to almost re-engineer it. But so it is a bit bigger, the actual production model, but it does now work.
Explain that in a little bit more detail, the turning moments, for those that don't understand like me.
Well, if you extend the leg by another 2 inches, if somebody tips on the chair, the strain on the joint where the seat rail meets the back leg is hugely improved, because you can do the mathematics of what happens on the leverage. But also the sheer bulk of the people have got, it's not the kind of thing we're allowed to say in public, but you know, the average weight of North Americans in Indiana has gone up significantly since 1961, when this chapel was opened. Or indeed Coventry Cathedral was opened, and they are much larger, and that is a big problem.
Chapel actually opened before Coventry Cathedral itself, didn't it? It was,
but it didn't start until 5 years after Coventry was started.
Because the plans were Basil Spencer's plans were in the public domain, weren't they?
They were heavily published, all in the architectural magazines. And I think the architect was a Swedish architect called Charles Stader. He'd obviously seen it in some of the architectural magazines and said, well, that's a good idea. Let's pump it up a bit and do a version of it.
Valparaiso, Indiana.
What else we got? Other horrors. Here you are. One of my pet horrors is polypropylene chairs in cathedrals. Apart from the fact they're a fire risk and they've caused terrible smoke damage when they go up in smoke, which they do and did at Peterborough and twice in Peterborough. But they go everywhere. And in the 70s and 80s, this was Corpus Christi College Dining Hall in Cambridge. Before actually designed by Robin Day, and we all know he's a very good designer, but these chairs were not designed for that kind of space. So we redesigned the chairs and polished up the tables. And I think you'll agree that the difference on the impact on the architecture is huge. But it's again trying to get the chair to be quite neutral, but to fit with that linen felt paneling, and that's very opulent decoration. More polypropylene chairs. This was Highgate School Library. A lot of these were made in the 60s and 70s and were very cheap to buy, and people did. But we changed the library. We put a mezzanine in, and just simply by changing the furniture, they got exactly the same space. We left the building exactly as it was, but they got a completely different space simply by changing the furniture. Oundrel School, this is before we started. It was pretty horrific. This was done in the 1980s. But again, just by changing the furniture and the handrail, we completely transformed the space. And apart from a lick of paint on the building, we didn't actually touch the building at all.
So we're speaking of libraries now, aren't we? This is a Q, I think if I'm getting it right.
I think it might be, yes.
Are we going to the other side of the world yet?
I think we're going to go to the other side of the world, Aidan. Yes. Now, you've been to this
long way from Broadway.
Well, this is a horror as well. This was the library in Beijing, Keystone Academy in Beijing, where I've been working for the last 5 years now. The entrance did look like this, which looked a bit like a hospital waiting room, but by changing the doorway, we changed everything really and got a kind of Chinese cultural theme running. Inside before was looking like this, and after it looked like this. Again,
why is the door round? Go back to the door.
Say again.
Why is the door round?
Well, there's a very strong tradition in Chinese culture of moon doors. It's very much part of the poetic and cultural tradition. You get them in gardens in Suzhou and places like that. And what we wanted to do is to make the library feel a little bit as though you were entering another world. The building itself is pretty ugly. It's thrown up in a very great hurry, like a lot of buildings in China. But the academy, which is led by a South African principal called Malcolm Mackenzie, his theme really when starting the school was to get what he called a Chinese thread running through international education, which is largely following the IB, and training them up before going off to universities in the United States and the UK. But he wanted the library to really speak of something cultural in China, but preparing the students for what they might expect if they go to a major university after they leave. And
are they going to find dragons in Rhode Island or Oxford or Cambridge, or what's the dragon?
Interestingly about dragons, my main client on this was a librarian who's a wonderful lady who you've met, called Sung Jing Ming. And she's incredibly well read in Chinese literature and in English literature. And she's the director of library services at the school, which has about 1,800 students. And we were trying to get some color into the library, some sort of visual excitement. And when in discussion, we discovered it's odd that, you know, dragons don't exist except in people's imagination. And they operate in North Wales and they operate in northern Mongolia. And they, in North Wales, they fly and breathe fire. And in Mongolia and China, they don't fly, but they do defend a conch shell. Why don't we have two door handles of a Welsh dragon and a Chinese dragon dancing together? Because the students will know that dragons don't exist, except for it being the thing they fear. So they have to grapple the thing they fear, which is ignorance, as they go into the library. And we had a lot of fun designing these, and we had them made by a wonderful sculptor in Edinburgh called Jill Watson. And the kids love them. It's become a kind of signature in the whole school. And they're gradually getting patinated like the St. Peter's toe in Rome, you know, polished within an inch of their lives. But they are great fun.
That's wonderful.
So that was before, that was after. We scoured the architectural salvage yards in Beijing, finding a few antiques as well. And this is before, and that's after. There's a lot of stories behind why the libraries designed that. And what color means in China is very significant. The lecture theatres were also, we just finished designing. This is before, it's so badly designed. So if you were the speaker, you were talking to an empty space most of the time, right at the bottom, and you could only get in 150 people. But by changing the seating round and just changing the furniture and a lick of paint, we get 40% more people in, and you're talking actually to the whole of the audience, and not just the people in the front row. So there we go. There's a little bit about Keystone, but Keystone has been fantastic. The Chinese absolutely adore books, and it's partly in an internet age when they know the party can switch off the internet at a click of a button. That the printed word has a particular sanctity for them, really, and it has done, you know, since they invented writing. If you go into a bookshop in Beijing or in Taipei or Guangzhou or anywhere, you'll find grandmothers, mothers, daughters, all sitting on the floor, sitting on the tables, absolutely crammed, reading anything they possibly can get their hands on. So it's been wonderful working with the Chinese and trying to get what libraries meant to them reflected in the building. And of course, we couldn't change the building around, but we could just change the furniture and redesign that interior. Been very stimulating and a very interesting use of furniture to express some kind of cultural meaning in those spaces. So then we go on, Botanic Institute. This is another building where one of the points I made when I spoke in February last year was about sometimes for us, the building is as much the client as the client is. And the building here was designed by Stanton Williams. It won the Sterling Prize. It won the pick of the Sterling Prizes, i.e. the best of the 10-year Sterling Prizes. It won 14 other architectural awards. And it is the Botanic Institute at Cambridge University. And we designed almost every stick of furniture in the whole building. It's a laboratory, really. It's a research laboratory in the Botanic Gardens in Cambridge. But you'll see here where the furniture is actually, we've got the colors of the leather matching the paintwork on the steel stanchions. And you'll see those shadow gaps on the steel stanchions. We've actually taken it through into the details of the furniture. But we're very much working with steel and leather and stitching details and high quality craftsmanship. Again, this is not mass production. It's batch production, sure, but it's about the understanding of the materials to try and get the whole thing to work structurally and visually, and to get some kind of harmony between the furniture and the building, furniture in architecture. If ever.
I should just mention that most of the projects that you're seeing are in the book, which is a plug, obviously, to buy the book. But this one particularly, I mean, out of all the enjoyable projects that I wrote about in the book, this one particularly, because it is a building of such extreme and extraordinary quality. And again, although, you know, metalworking isn't my thing, I know very well that the way that the architects and Luke as a designer worked together on developing these architectural elements, you know, the moves like the shadow gaps and so forth, the way that the furniture and the architecture work together is seamless, and it does really lift the soul. It's just something that makes you can stand there and feel how complete a creation the architecture, the building, the furniture together really is. And anybody who spends any time in this building will find themselves uplifted. It's an absolute truth. It's a wonderful piece of work, Luke.
Yeah, thank you. There is a kind of musical resonance. We might come on to music later on, but I always feel that when things are right, you feel the harmonic reverberating in the right way. And when it's wrong, like the polypropylene chairs in Winchester Cathedral, it just feels like, you know, it just discordant is exactly exactly the word. What have we got next? Oh, this is another fun building. This was a Foster building we did for Yale. Yale's become one of our biggest clients, actually. We keep on doing projects there. It's magnificent. It's the business school, basically, in Yale, in New Haven. And you'll see the brown benches against that wonderful blue that they've got in the building there. Well, we designed all of those. And you don't really notice them as furniture, but they're doing a hell of a lot, one of which is articulating the space. And you don't notice them because they feel part of the building. But it's amazing how people just gather around them, partly to sit on and perch on and be students together, but also they're plugging in their cell phones to charge them up and having little seminars around them and so on. But amazingly, they couldn't get it made in America. We needed to go to really high quality upholsterers, actually in the Worcestershire area, and the steelwork was done in Birmingham. But we had to make the whole lot in 9 weeks and get it dispatched, knocked down, and there were 24 of these benches altogether. It was quite a challenge, but again, upholstery of that quality, you can't do that out of a factory. It needs love. And I was very thrilled when I was coming back from China on one trip to see IBM were doing this advert of IBM advertising their new voice recognition system. And there was Bob Dylan sitting on one of the benches. I thought, yes, this is a great moment. But you can get it on YouTube. But I want to go to IBM and ask them if we can use the photograph, because they didn't recognize us as the designers of the furniture, but it's worth a try. So where are we going? I think we're going back to...
We're going to why and how it was that Luke Hughes became a furniture. First of all, would you say you were a craftsman before you became a designer?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. How did that happen?
Well, it started definitely at home. And I think there are parallels here with what Ernest Jimson and Ashby and Barnsley might have done as well. They started off as architects and went to craftsmanship that way. I started the other way. I was brought up in a very beautiful house, which is where I'm speaking now, which my parents restored in the early 1960s. It was very derelict, as you'll see. But we had next door this wonderful building, 14th century castle. The house was really derelict. I was 5 when we arrived here. But for all kinds of reasons, it had been abandoned really for about 40 years. And I was absolutely hypnotized by all the craftsmen who were working on the building, the stonemasons, the carpenters, the roofers, the lead workers, and everything else, as my parents tried to restore the house in 1962. I mean, it really was, it's a wonderful piece of work. It's quite small, but it's very, very handsome. There's some lovely details, as you can see, but it was in a pretty bad way. And there you are, that was the courtyard. Anyway, it's a little bit better there. But the next door, of course, as boys, my brother and I, we had the castle. And after the castle closed in the evenings, it became ours as far as we were concerned. And it's a marvelous sort of Chaucerian folly. It was blown up in the Civil War under hideously romantic circumstances. And the house is, you can just see the chimney of the house in the left-hand side. We were really close to the castle. So my brother and I did the one thing that boys always do, is go and climb all over it. And this is where we started becoming mountaineers. You can see me climbing up the wall here on the outskirts. But by learning the southeast face of Wardour Castle, all our rock climbing skills, we also found this fascinating thing of masons' marks. And of course, the stonemasons who built castles like Wardour or cathedrals like Salisbury, on the whole, were illiterate, and they were paid by the cubic yard or so of how much stone they may have laid in any particular month. And the supervisor would have gone away for 2 or 3 months and come back. Okay, I'll pay you according to what you've done. What have you done? Well, their marks were left. And it was great fun climbing all over the castle and finding the identity of some of these masons. And to my total delight, you will find some in Salisbury Cathedral, you'll find them in at Bodiam Castle, with the bits that are built at the same time. And it was obviously the same stonemason. He may not have been called Alan Harvey or Trevor Ballinger, but he had an identity. And I loved that idea that here was the mark of the man who put that stone there, which I still feel intrinsically goes to the heart of some of the things we'll touch on later about the arts and craft movement.
Speaking of later, look, I hate to tell you, but we have been going 45 minutes.
Okay, well, we better speed up then. Okay, so as far as my background is concerned, down the road was Julian Bream. He had a barn there, which he was renting out to a piano restorer called Mike Johnson. And here is Mike, still alive, amazingly, 86. And when I was 13, I went to sweep up for him in school holidays. And when I was there when he made his first harpsichord. But when I took this photograph last year, he just made his 200th harpsichord. And I was very, very lucky to work with him in those school holidays. And by the time I had gone to university, I knew all about ebony and bubinga and paduk and rosewood and Swiss pear and all the things that go into making very complex bits of woodwork. Mike taught me so much in that time. And when I got to university, I studied history of architecture. I kept on thinking, why is this not a problem? Why do I understand about craftsmanship? And a lot of it was what I learned when I was doing work for Mike at that time. Then I went off from school. I went off for a year in the Merchant Navy with Blue Funnel. Jonathan, I know you spent some time in Hong Kong, but this is Hong Kong Harbour in 1975, the old Blue Funnel cargo liner on which I served as a midshipman. Blue Funnel were then one of the major cargo lines in the Southeast Asia. But I was working on that ship for 11 months, mostly with the Chinese carpenter who was called Mr. Jiang. And he taught me a whole series of other things, like how to shore up a cargo in a typhoon, and how to, which is rather different from making harpsichords. But it was about thinking
inlay in that then.
Not much that. But apart from that, when the weather was not so bad, he'd be fishing driftwood out of the sea and making cabinets for his wife before he got back to Hong Kong. He was absolutely fantastic craftsman. And I was completely hypnotized by the skill and the ingenuity and his brain and what he would do with his hands and think with his hands in ways that, going to university, like a university like Cambridge, everybody sort of thinking that brain was everything. It's not. And that was the thing that was very, very clear to me from working with people like that. When I left Cambridge, I worked in the Morris Traveller Centre doing up the woodwork on Morris miners to try and keep body and soul together. And they had a lot of mechanics who were rebuilding the Morrises, but they had very few people who could do the woodwork. Well, after a combination of Mr. Jiang and Mike Johnson, a bit of ash woodwork on a Morris Traveller was easy. So I was quite in demand for a couple of years, and that got me through doing a law degree after I left Cambridge. But then I knew after
middle class education, basically, you know, the middle class education through and through, and the education of the intelligent fingers, if you like, has all been by experience. So here you are now in your workshop in wherever it is you're going to tell us.
Lamb's Conduit Street in 1978,
Yeah.
79.
And what did your parents say about this career choice of yours?
Well, interesting. Actually, my pa was always very supportive. He was rather a romantic character, and he quite liked the idea of sort of son of toil. But he recognised that although I got the law under my belt, it wasn't something that turned me on in any way. My mother was much more cautious, as mothers tend to be. But you know, I was going to make my own mind up. I wasn't going to be told what to do as far as that was concerned. Actually, what I'm working on here is the archive library for the Grenadier Guards, and there's a bit of a funny story. But I've got time to tell that story, Aidan.
It depends. You know, it's not up to me. I can sit here for the rest of the evening, Luke.
Well, I started working on building sites in '79, and the workshop at the back of Lamb's Conduit Street in Bloomsbury was tiny, but I did go into a builder's merchant. And to buy some materials, and there was a whole long queue of builders also buying materials. And this very tall, very elegant figure came in and said, "Anybody here want to put up a kitchen shelf?" And most of the builders who in front of me, the queue, all looked at their toes and shuffled a bit rather nervously. And I looked round and I suddenly thought, well, I'll do it. He said, "Oh, really? Oh, it was just come back to my house in Jubilee Place." Turned out he was the colonel of the 1st Battalion of the Grenadier Guards. And he, after I put his kitchen shelf up, he said, "Oh, you're rather good at this. Wouldn't like to make some bookshelves in the drawing room, would you? And how about some wardrobes?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." So 3 months later, he said, "Wouldn't like to make the archive library for the Grenadier Guards in the Wellington Barracks, would you?" And I said, "Have you ever made a library?" And I said, "Nope." He said, "But I'd give it a go." So the next thing I spent is 4 months in the Wellington Barracks in 1981, I suppose it must have been, when they went back into that barracks, making all the archive library for all their photo albums for the Crimea and the Boer War and the First World War. It was a wonderful, wonderful break. But I suppose I've been very lucky by having breaks like that and clients who've had the courage, I suppose, to say, get on with it. But there I am actually working on that library. But we then called it Bloomsbury Joinery because I was in Lamb's Conduit Street, but I got turfed out of there because I didn't have building permission. So I moved to an old banana warehouse in 1981 in Covent Garden, just off Drury Lane. At that stage, we were still calling it Bloomsbury Joinery. But we had the machines up on the first floor, and then we had the benches downstairs. We only moved out a couple of years ago, and that's the early workshop team. There's Christian Jebb, who came to work for us at that stage to do the admin, and Joss and Mark Adams and I. But it was tiny, and when we didn't make major jobs, we had to go and make them out in the street. But Covent Garden was rather fun in those days. And nobody seemed to mind too much. They were making we made 24 of these circular benches for a shopping centre in Harrow, all out in the street in Covent Garden. But it was fairly typical of some of the jobs we had at the time. And deliveries were quite old-fashioned and local in those days. We were right next door to the guy who managed all the barrows for the Covent Garden market. And he used to let us use his barrows for delivering locally, which was quite fortunate. It was happy times. But I was getting pretty hungry at that stage. And I started then designing for industrial production or batch production. And we designed a range of bedroom furniture in the mid-80s called the Ovolo Collection, which sold very well for a few years through stores like Liberty and General Trading Company and John Lewis and so on, until Marks and Sparks started ripping us off. And then we got squashed by that. But then I had another big problem, which was mountaineering had taken on a new lease of life, really. And I sort of thought in my early 30s that I was now or never to go and do the big peaks. And this is Shishapangma in Tibet, the big mountain on the right. And we went on an expedition there in '87. It was a great peak, and we had a long time on the mountain. Wonderful caravan of yaks coming through there. We did actually get up on the ridge. We were there at 7,800 meters for about a week. And it got quite stormy, quite tense in places. Here we are at the top, but then the clouds came in, and we had to actually dig a snow hole into the side of the mountain just to get out of the storm. You can see the winds gathering on that particular summit. So we dug in and got extremely cold and thin and very proud to be British, and made ourselves reasonably comfortable as we could. When we came out the next day, where I'd been grabbing my ice axe for the last 4 days, it was down to about -40. My fingers had got quite badly frostbitten. And I realized that was a 6 months then, really, that I couldn't really use tools in the workshop. And that did force me, when I got back to London, to think much more seriously about designing for other people to make. I mean, I'd been making for 15 years by then, and there wasn't much I didn't know about putting bits of wood together, but it forced me to do the thing that I didn't really want to do. I'm going to show you a quick slide of what happens to Stephen's toes. So I'll give you a spoiler alert. It's pretty nasty, but see what happened to his toes. Okay. Frostbite's pretty nasty stuff, but
so let's get to arts and crafts and the early pioneers thereof. All of them, apart with the arguable exception of Philip Clisset, profoundly middle class. You know, Jimson, Morris, Ashby, all these people. So there's definitely a tradition there, isn't there?
They had they all had a much larger private income.
Yes, yes,
Morris was rich, and so was Jimson. Had private means, a considerable amount actually, so they could indulge in this. Clisset was the one that they were all impressed by, and there he is with his one of his rushback chairs. But Morris and Ruskin had set the tone of the arts and craft movement. Really was a kind of repudiation of the dehumanizing effects of industrialization. But actually, with all that it came at a time when Europe was rethinking its economy because of the collapse of grain prices in the 1870s. And it's a little bit like what's been going on in the last few years. You know, the effects of globalization at that time suddenly made this romantic ideal much more palatable to those who could afford to go and live it. And there was an idealism, I think, about the arts and craft early pioneers. And I put these three portraits up now, but because it's very, not least because I know Annette is on the call today, but she's written a marvelous book about Jimson. But quite interestingly, from Morris onwards, there is one common thread with all the people that we're talking about, including Gordon Russell, including Ashby, and so on, which is the Art Workers Guild. It's still going. You'll see this is the outside of the building today on the left. The middle is Jimson's version of the Philip Clisset chair. They have a complete set of 100 of these chairs, which actually speak back to the early chair making techniques of the 17th and 18th century, but Clisset was still making them. And they were actually belonged to the Guild even before they moved to this building. It's an incredible collection. But they have on the right the list of the past masters of the Guild going back to 1884. And you'll see on the bottom slide, 1962, Gordon Russell, where he was master as well. But there is an intellectual thread that goes through the Art Workers Guild link. They all knew each other. All those who came to Gloucestershire and so on, they knew each other, they met regularly, and they were passing those ideas around, not just on paper, but actually by meeting, sometimes once or twice a month. And it's interesting, when Ashby came to Gloucestershire, I think in early 1902 or thereabouts. I think Jimson had moved down, Annette will correct me, but I think it's 1893 or earlier thereabouts. But suddenly there are things that are happening in technology, which is the motor car and bicycle and railways and the telephone and electricity, which is changing everything, including the possibility of some of these romantic ideals. After the First World War, when Gordon really gets the business going of course, there's another series of things going on. One is the tourism, you know, cars could get to the Lig and Arms and other, so they start making furniture for that. But, you know, by the 1930s, they're making radios because that's another change of technology, which has driven all of this. And Dick, who had been an architect, was an architect, very distinguished architect, you know, was working with projects like Coventry Cathedral, but is a response to the economics of the time and the technology. And I do think that this is where the next phase, if you like, is so relevant today. The other key people on this are people like Peter Walls, who I think I'm right in saying actually trained up and worked as the foreman for many of the guys who were working for Jimson. He was Dutch and ended up by going to Loughborough and setting up one of the training courses there, which Barnsley then took over at a later date. But this idea of a couple of key individuals being the relay baton holders, if you like. And from Barnsley, it goes to someone like Alan Peters, who picks up the baton, having trained with Barnsley and going off to do his things. Now, they had a great argument about the role of machines in all of this.
Barnsley was doctrinaire about this, wasn't he? He didn't even.
Barnsley was bonkers about it, I think, really. I mean, I mean, he was very, yes, he's very doctrinaire. I think he softened in later life, but there was a tension between what was true handwork and what the machine could do for you. And Gordon, I think he summed it up in that immortal phrase, which I like very much, about, you know, you've got a problem about machines, you've got to teach them some manners. Which is
I think this is really a key thing, because to my mind, Barnsley was, like I say, is doctrinaire. He held on to the whole idea of handwork as an idea, and to, you know, his pupil, call it, Alan Peters on the right, who I first came across when I was editing Woodworker magazine, who I've always had an absolutely immense respect and admiration for his craftsmanship. But he wasn't going to turn his back on machinery. He recognized what it could do, and as you say, the kind of key figure in the way that this generation of craftspeople, and right up through to including you, Luke, who recognize that you are very much part of this tradition. You know, it's a sensible and altogether practical engagement with those things that can take that can save you time, that can to some extent save you money. Machinery doesn't mean that you don't practice craft. And you know that where we're headed, I know in your talk, is where we're going with digital technology right now. But Barnsley, I think, even, you know, by the time he was in the 40s, 50s, I think he first brought electricity to his workshop in 1955. If I'm,
yes, it's a bit late.
I mean, this was, as far as I could see, self-defeating, really. And, you know, for him to have helped educate craftspeople like Alan Peters, who then in later life started taking inspiration from Japanese joinery and Japanese work. You can see him cutting out the bowl in that table.
Did you ever go to his workshop down in Kentisbeare?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
It was like a laboratory.
Yeah.
I mean, it was absolutely immaculate. He was so well equipped, his machine shop. But he still had that thing about where it was necessary to bring that handwork and the love, the passion. I mean, that's, I think you and I, we hit on a phrase, I think, when we were doing the book, that, I mean, the arts and craft movement, you know, it's a mood, not a mantra.
Yeah.
And I think that the principles of where the machine finishes and has its limitations, and the hand and the eye and the intellect still has a role, is on the selection of materials and that final bit that makes it humanized in a way. I mean, it's interesting. I could talk a lot about people like Alan. I mean, huge, profound influence on me in the early days. And I don't know, I was actually writing a review of something that he'd done for Woodworker, which is how I first got to know him. And then we ended up by doing a show for Art in Action for a couple of years together. And we got on really well. And I got some lovely letters from him about exactly these issues. But he hated the art school mentality at the time. But he was a phenomenal craftsman. He's like Martin Grierson, who was another one who was just, you know, was so wonderful to watch. And absolutely brilliant maker. But we've got other brilliant makers. I mean, here are some of them local to you. Alan and his team, Alan Harvey and Trevor Ballinger, and a lot of the all ex-GR, most of these guys. some I think might even be on the call today. Did I see Colin? Maybe it was there earlier on, but I mean, some of you, you'll recognize some of them. These guys have been working, they came out of Gordon Russell. We've been using them on and off for the last 30 years. And the funny thing is, although the big factory is gone, the individual guys have not. It's the mason's marks, if you like. They do have an identity. The individuals are really important in the selection of the materials, the finishing, that thing that brings it all alive. There's some more here, I think. There's more of Trevor, and I won't introduce you to them all, but there's some very funny characters here. There's a wonderful photograph. I know David Snell's on the call. There's a wonderful photograph of Alan looking at David, and David's just told him he didn't like very much what Alan had done. So that's a bit of anger going on there. And that on the bottom right is Georgi Mkatuchian. He's the carver who carved the eels on at Ely, and Mike Gilder just above him in his spray shop. But these guys do have an identity, and it's exactly what people like Jimson and Barnsley and the others all understood. Now, conversely, what has also happened because of new technology is communication. This is my team in 2018 in London, but we don't run these workshops or own these workshops, but we work with a loose association. I mean, that job in China we were using 19 workshops to build 24 tons of furniture in 4 months and get it shipped to China in 6 containers. There's a lot of logistics on this, but we have this loose arrangement of the small workshops because we can communicate, we can use digital phones, we can use the computer-driven machines, which are quite cheap now. We can communicate very, very fast all over the world. It is possible to do that, and the economics of appealing to the small workshop, appealing to the passion in the small workshop, the people who own their own destiny, that is one of the things that I think is still really, really relevant. I think the other thing is, identity. It was great when I was able to introduce Alan Harvey to the Prince of Wales in 2010 on his 65th birthday. But it wouldn't have been many opportunities when I'd got him up to London to meet the Prince. But that went down extremely well, and it's exactly the kind of recognition that was deserved at the time. I've got one other person to really say who's sadly not joining us today, but I did speak to him this morning, and that's Ray Lee, because Ray, I know, is very much loved within the Gordon Russell Trust Museum, and the whole firmament of Gordon Russell. But Ray is so much the link, and I've known him since the early 80s, and he's been an incredible influence and help in passing down some of this knowledge, if you like. And it was been a great pleasure when we did sign the agreement on the Coventry chair, which I'm so pleased has been able to generate some revenue for the museum. It's something that I hope will continue for many years still to come, when we can find the jobs. I think that
looks like it, Luke.
I think that's it, guys. Yeah.
Go back to the book just to remind everybody to buy it. I didn't manage to succeed in my plan of talking almost as much as you did, but you've got, some great stories. So thank you very, very, very much indeed.
Just a very few concluding thoughts from me. First of all, so far as the book is concerned, in the link that you received, the email about joining this talk, you will have seen the discount code that's available. So if you want to buy the book through the book publisher and you click on the link and enter the relevant code, you can get the book at a discount of 20%. If, on the other hand, you are replete with funds, then you can buy the book at its full, undiscounted price from the Gordon Russell Design Museum, and we can take the 20% and probably a bit more as well. And if you want to do it that way, then either drop me an email to the address that was given in that email. Drop me an email, or you can drop an email to the museum, which is the address that Jonathan's been using. Either way, if you do want a copy of the book in that way, then we may even be able to get the author and Luke to sign it for you.
We're very happy.
The second thing to say is that one of the things we tell visitors to the museum, I hope with a grain of truth to it, is that Gordon Russell, after coming to Broadway, went to school in Chipping Campden. And when he started going to school there, to the grammar school, he was there at the same time as Ashby and his whole crew. Although, of course, Ashby went bankrupt, or the Guild went bankrupt in 1908. But what we tell visitors is that Gordon was inspired by seeing members of the Guild and indeed the local craftsmen. And so I found it fascinating to hear Luke describe how, having moved into this house, this derelict house with his parents, he was equally fascinated to see the craftsmen at work on the building and to get inspiration from that. And so there does seem to me to be a resonance between Sir Gordon Russell's story and Luke's in that regard. And the third and final thing I wanted to say was just to express my thanks to Luke and Aidan for what I found an absolutely fascinating evening. I've learned a lot. The whole thing has worked seamlessly, and I extend, and I'm sure I extend everybody's hearty thanks to them both for an entertaining evening. Thank you both.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you guys. Very, very much enjoyable. Very enjoyable.